I was just talking about the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty in a past segment, and I am delighted to have joining me on the phone Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty's Research Director, Will Flanders. Good morning, Will. How are you?
Good morning. Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for coming on a Monday. I know how hard, trust me, I know how hard it is to get up early on a
We
Monday.
we just got back from my fiance had a wedding in Pittsburgh last night. We got back here to Milwaukee around midnight. So
Oh,
we'll see how this
wow.
goes.
Well, well, thank you. I was probably still tossing and turning at midnight, knowing that I had to get up at 3:30 this morning. So
Oh,
I,
geez.
I feel your pain. I feel your pain for sure. Well, I'm glad you made it back, and and we're going to talk about a topic that isn't too thrilling because it's just another reminder of how poorly the schools in the state of Wisconsin are doing as a whole. I know that there's an analysis that you recently did about holding kids back in Wisconsin schools, and what did you find?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we're looking at the sort of dreadful proficiency rates that we see across the state, what we're looking for, what are some of the solutions that are out there? And one of the key things that we see in states that have improved their reading numbers in recent years, states like Mississippi, not a state you usually think of as doing a good job, but actually they're sort of surpassing us in reading growth lately, is one, they're using this science of reading, which is, going back to the basics, going back to phonics, sort of getting rid of this modern teaching stuff that's come in the last 30 years. And two, they're willing to hold kids back based on the state exam. And these two things are interrelated. You can't have one without the other. Simply holding kids back isn't enough. But when you put those two things together, what we see is that when we get rid of social promotion, putting kids forward that aren't ready to go on to the next grade, coupled with intense training in the science of reading, that's how you help students learn to read, and that's how you get them prepared ultimately for success in life.
So, did you find in that the okay, I'll say it. I don't like to refer to it as the pandemic. The shamdemic had a lot to do with this, or is this just maybe highlighted it or outlined it much more now that parents are more aware of what's going on with their kids after the whole virtual learning situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly, Wisconsin had its struggles before the pandemic, but what we have seen is that those districts that refuse to reopen, districts like Milwaukee and Madison, that stayed shut down into a second school year, which is sort of absurd to think about at this point, there was a big divergence. Those schools saw their reading proficiency levels fall a lot further than schools that reopened. And as we've been saying for a couple of years now, we're going to be dealing with the consequences of this for the foreseeable future, right? For the entire time these kids are in school, the consequences of those politically driven decisions are going to have an impact. And, policies like moving more towards the science of reading, and again, including a retention policy with that, that's the only way we're going to help catch some of these kids up, in my opinion.
So, speaking of politically driven policies, let's talk about the 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 left's ins, insistence that a better education is only through more money. Because, I mean, how much does it actually cost to teach kids how to read? Or how much does it actually cost to ensure that school children are proficient in something as basic as reading?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that education has gotten so expensive in this state, and I'll plug our school scorecard at will-law.org. You can see the spending levels for every district in the state, and many of them are over $17,000 or $18,000 per kid. But one of the reasons that's happened is that, sort of inherent in education, and, I was an education major in undergrad, so I've seen some of this, is that we're always looking for the next best thing instead of sticking with what works. There's always this revolutionary idea. And in reading policy, it's been a move away from phonics. It's been a move towards sort of looking at pictures to figure out what the words are. Let's not build kids the biggest vocabulary. Let's just have them figure things out on their own. 30 years of experience has told us that direction didn't work. And yet, school districts, instead of going back to what did work, and generally was probably more inexpensive because it's already been established, they're continually sort of trying to innovate. It's not all negative. In some instances, I think their heart is in the right place. But instead of trying to create new and better versions of everything, let's stick with what worked for 40 years, back when kids actually did graduate from high school, knowing how to fill out a job application because they could actually read it.
Well, and I don't know, there's just something about the time-honored tradition of reading, writing, and arithmetic and sticking to the basics in order to be able to function in society once you're done with your public school so-called education. And I mean, as you stated, if kids are ill prepared as when they become adults to function in society, what what is the solution? And I guess let's go back to the topic of this conversation and how it's determined that children should be held back as opposed to pushing them forward when they're not able to read at well, I don't even know, below grade level in some cases.
Yeah, our proposal, our sort of very modest proposal in this policy brief, is that we consider, and there should be some off ramps, holding kids back that are in the very lowest level of proficiency. So we have five categories of proficiency on the forward exam. The lowest level is called below basic. We're not even talking about basic. And the third category, proficiency, we're definitely not talking about proficiency. We're simply talking about the kids that are in the very lowest category that are struggling the most. Unfortunately, in this state, that category encompasses 26% of third graders, which is the level of where we might want to consider holding kids back a little more. Obviously, that's not a tenable policy. No parent would go along with that. But some subset of that group absolutely needs further help. We can sort of determine what's a reasonable amount to hold back. But when 26% of the kids are in the below basic category statewide, that should be a huge fire alarm for everyone across the state that's concerned about our future workforce needs and just concerned about our kids in general.
Are you finding that there's any correlation to, I don't know, socioeconomic class or I don't know, family income and the ability to read at grade level or be proficient at reading?
Absolutely. This is one of the biggest predictors of future success in life is can the student read to a proficient level by the end of third grade? There's a mountain of evidence, not just things that we've produced, but across the country and probably across the world as well, that shows if kids are not reading well by that age, their chance of graduating from high school drops significantly. And we all know, if a kid doesn't graduate from high school, while there can be exceptions, they're making it more likely that they're going to have a difficult time in life finding a meaningful career with solid pay, not becoming someone who's a drain on the public welfare system. So we know this from a mountain of evidence, and that's why the focus is on this third grade reading and making sure before kids are promoted on to fourth grade, they actually know the basics.
So do you think that, this might be a facetious question, but do you think that DPI is going to take this evidence and actually make this a priority to address children that maybe set a goal that to ensure that all children are proficient at reading by third grade?
Well, the track record of DPI and focusing instead on things like diversity, making or focusing on non-accountability certainly doesn't make me too I wouldn't be betting on it. Let's say that much. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's going to take state legislative action to bring something like this to bear. DPI has shown themselves sort of willing to give lip service to the problems of reading in the state, but they've been unwilling to make changes. There was a bill last legislative session, did not include statewide retention policy, but was a good science of reading based bill that was ultimately vetoed by the governor, who obviously is a product of DPI. There is hope that this legislative session things might be different, and there might be an opportunity for both sides to come together and produce a meaningful reform. As usual, I'll believe it when I see it. But I think certainly we can't allow DPI to continue to do things on their own when we have a situation where 26% of kids are below basic and over half of kids are not even meeting proficiency.
What kind of numbers do you see? Have you studied WASA school districts numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. So the percentage of kids that was held back in Wausau during the last school year that DPI has data available was 0.02%, not 2%, 0.02%. Wow. There were less than 5 kids throughout the whole district that were held back at any grade level, not just looking at the third grade level. So there is big variation throughout the state. There are a couple districts that were holding back as much as 6% of kids. But when you look at, again, those states that we're using as a benchmark, they're routinely holding back 5 or 6% of kids across the state because that's about the share of kids that you think might need additional help. And again, it's difficult for families, to hear that your kid might need to be held back. But When you think about things like their friend group and things like that. But what families have to remember is that, a little more difficulty in socialization right now, trade that for sort of a lifetime that's more likely to be successful, more likely to graduate high school, more likely to go on to college, more likely to have a good career. I think having to find a new friend group in a lot of cases can make that worthwhile.
So, is is the fact that the retention policy or the retention rate in WASA is so low? Does that have is it correlated with the proficiency level? Because as far as I remember, I think that WASA does not have a impressive proficiency rate.
That's right. It's certainly, our analysis statewide. So we looked at every district and their retention rates and compared that to future reading outcomes. And we did find that there's a relationship that districts that hold kids back more, accounting for a lot of other factors like economic status and all the boring stuff you have to include in every sort of an analysis, is correlated with future success. Holding kids back more today leads to more reading proficiency tomorrow. The percentages aren't huge. It's not making a huge difference. Another reason for that is that we haven't fully implemented the science of reading for these kids that are held back. We think those numbers could be even greater if we were fully implementing a science of reading curriculum like that bill we mentioned earlier from the previous legislative session plans to do.
Do you anticipate bipartisan support with this, or is proficiency only a priority for Republicans?
So I think that there are challenges particularly for the left, when it comes to holding kids back. I think that when you think about sort of the general notion of tough love and things like that, those aren't concepts that are popular on the left in general.
Right.
There is, the potential for more bipartisan support, I think, in general on the reading, science of reading stuff. But if we include this retention policy, while I'd hope for bipartisan support because the research supports it, I think that's going to be a little bit of a harder lift and something that's going to be a little more challenging.
Well, and I guess the word, excuse me, that I was searching for when you and I were talking off air was there is a stigma, I guess, that's attached to having your child held back. And, of course, not my child, but everyone else's child, I suppose is the attitude. But perhaps if it's explained in a way, or I don't want to use the term marketed in a way that actually demonstrates that it's it's in the child's best interest and it's in the child's best interest for his or her future, perhaps that would be a way to make it more, I don't know, palatable or acceptable if a child is held back for the really the true right reasons.
Yeah, we're certainly not promoting, sort of widespread willy-nilly holding kids back here, right? The idea is that we create a policy that's focused on those kids that are struggling the most. And you're absolutely right that making or helping parents to understand the sort of lifelong implications if your child can't read well by the end of third grade is the best path for making that more acceptable. It's a it's a tough thing. We're never going to pretend that it's easy to tell your child they're going to have to make new friends and potentially lose some of their friend group, and be maybe the oldest kid in class, which can be sort of a stigma. But ultimately, over the course of their lifetime, in many cases, I think you'd see the kids would actually be thankful that this happened because when they're in high school and they're asked to read in class and they can't read a paragraph, that's also going to lead to a social stigma, right? When they're the kid that can't even get through some basic job applications or other things that are school related. So it's a trade-off. There are consequences, there are challenges that come along with it, but making families understand that this is in the long-term benefit of the kid, I think that's what most all parents are concerned about.
Well, and let's just go back to DPI. If they make it a priority, I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking of these different jingles or different marketing techniques. Great reading by grade 3. Some sort of program that would encourage and maybe even incentivize teachers to ensure that although of course I don't want to completely blame teachers for this, but maybe make it a partnership with the teacher, the parent, and the student, proficient by grade 3. I mean, some sort of plan that DPI could implement. But again, I don't know if perhaps this is better in legislative form, and then it forces DPI's hand in promoting it, I guess, to all the public schools here in Wisconsin.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And again, when you look at states that have implemented things like this, like Mississippi, you have seen parental buy-in over time. Parents have come to understand that this is the critical point, and what they have there is buy-in from their Department of Public Instruction, buy-in from the governor, and buy-in from the legislature, buy-in across the board, and from families. And that is absolutely important if you're going to make this work. And I think you're right. A marketing campaign around that should be a central part of any plan to implement a policy like this. So I'm not going to come up with a jingle, so I'll leave that to you perhaps.
All right. Well, that's kind of my specialty, but yeah, I just think why wouldn't we focus instead of the diversity, equity, and inclusion and the transgender that's being pushed, the transgender agenda in the public schools. Hey, let's just focus on getting our kids to read first. I mean, isn't that a more worthy uh, objective, and isn't that a more worthy priority? It just seems to me to make sense that we want to have a literate society as opposed to the alternative. But I don't know. Maybe Democrats have different objectives because that keeps the low information voter in their pockets.
Yeah, if you're thinking about what's going to improve the lot in life for folks from low-income families, for folks from minority families, help them overcome, the challenges that are presented to them, it's knowing how to read. It's being able to achieve success in life by being able to get that job, being able to successfully apply to colleges, apply for grants, and things like that. So rather than focusing on telling kids it's not your fault, you're oppressed by the system,
Oh,
let's
right.
focus instead on teaching kids so that they can overcome whatever challenges may actually exist. Right? Let's give them the tools to overcome that, rather than sort of telling them that there's no chance for them and no hope. And it's good that DPI thinks they can focus on all these things because they've solved all the other problems, but our
Right.
proficiency data
hmm
would tell us otherwise.
Yeah, I mean the basics, just the basics we're asking for. Well, great job, Will. I appreciate it so very much. Will Flanders from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I sincerely appreciate your time this morning, and I'll talk with you again, I'm sure, soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.